Okay, well, I'm about to blow your mind. A lot of you guys probably haven't really put a lot of thought into this, but I know you've heard people talk about waiting on conditions to stabilize, waiting on the water to stabilize. I think that's what happens with the bite around South Point, like on Lake Wiley, for example. I think that, and not just Lake Wiley, but any reservoir that has a river portion. You have your river portion on Lake Wiley, and you guys know how it works on a lake with a river portion. If they're running water, sometimes it's hit or miss most times, but if they're running water, you can shoot up river, getting some good current, anchor up, and usually you won't catch many fish, but when you do, they're usually pretty good fish. The unofficial Lake Wiley record come from upriver in the current. So that said, current plays a huge role in what the fish do. So hear me out. This is a theory that I came up with this theory. Well, it's not my theory, but it's just a bunch of information that I've gathered and that I've made sense of. A lot of times on a reservoir, especially like Lake Wiley, even when you come out of the river section, like I wouldn't consider, around South Point boat ramp, all the way down to Mill Creek, I wouldn't consider that the river section. But it gets a lot of flow. There's a good bit of current there sometimes, depending on how much water they're running. So if you're out there and there's a lot of current, the bite can be good. You about fish it like you would a river. What's happening, and the reason the bite is so hit or miss there, is because when the conditions have stabilized, let's say you're getting a lot of current, and you're getting a lot of current every day, and it's on schedule. Let's say that they're turning the wheels on every day at 10 o'clock in the morning, and they're running them to midnight, and they've been doing this every day for several weeks. Those conditions have stabilized. When that happens, fishing's usually pretty good. Well, when they shut the water off or they start running a lot less water for a less amount of time, and you have little to no current there, the bite usually sucks until it stabilizes. The same way as when they're running water, when they stop running water or as much water or not running it as long, then it needs to stabilize. Then it could take however long, days, a week, who knows. The way you can find out if it's stabilized, if the water's been shut off, is to go out at night, put a light out, in the summertime. If you don't draw any plankton around, the water hasn't stabilized. If you're not drawing any plankton, I usually go to another spot sometimes. Sometimes I just do it once. Sometimes I don't do it at all. But it is a tactic that I've used a lot, especially when I striper fish. It really works when you're striper fishing because, like at Lake Murray, for example, when you tie up to the towers in the summertime and you're fishing over 150, 60 feet, suspended over 150 feet of water, you're catching those stripers out of that stratified water, out of the thermocline. If you go out to the tower and you put a light out and you're not drawing in any plankton or bait, I would always move. If I wasn't drawing in plankton or bait, I would always move to the big pool. I'd go troll the humps, I'd troll the big pool, I'd do something different. What's happening, and a reason could be that you're not drawing in bait or plankton, is that the plankton has been diluted. Like when it rains, if you get a little bit of rain, it could actually stimulate plankton growth and make the bite better. I know you guys have probably heard or know that, or at least you've heard your uncle say it. I won't fish unless it's raining. I've heard people say that. That's why. Now, if you've noticed, if we get a crap load of rain, fishing sucks unless you're fishing current. Then it's good. But if you get a lot of rain, it's diluting the plankton is what it's doing. And we're not putting enough thought and effort on learning because there's a plankton migration. We're not putting enough time and effort into the plankton, and that is the very base source of the food chain. The entire web starts with plankton. You have your zooplankton, which are from plants, and then you have your phytoplankton from plants, and then you have your zooplankton, which are from animals, like mussels. Mussel larvae could be zooplankton. If you look at like the backs of creeks, the reason bait's up in there is because it's shallow and the sun can penetrate all of everything in the back of the creek, and algae growth. Then you have your phytoplankton. There's not a whole lot of current there's just wind-driven current, but there's not a whole lot of current to like dilute the plankton out of the area. So you always have the algae, you have the phytoplankton feeding on the algae, you have the zooplankton feeding on the phytoplankton, you have the fad minnows feeding on the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, you have your shad, you have your carp, you have all these filter feeding, plankton eating fish in that area. That's why you have predatory fish up in that area. And a lot of times there's not enough dissolved oxygen, especially if you have a lot of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is going to eat your oxygen up. Zooplankton will too, but your zooplankton is going to keep the phytoplankton under control and make it manageable. But if you got a lot of plankton in the back of a creek, more than likely you're going to have low oxygen levels. So it's going to keep predatory fish out. They can't take the oxygen. They want to be comfortable. I mean, yeah, they're hungry, but they want to be comfortable. And sometimes they will go up in these areas, even when it's oxygen depleted, to feed, but they won't stay long. They come right back out. And a lot of the areas that we fish at night, the catfish will transition from, I know you guys have set up on channel ledges, like when it's getting dark, where you're waiting on that night bite, that transition, that evening bite, from when the catfish actually move from being deep. They'll move up shallow to feed. They're moving up shallow to feed because of the plankton. So if there's no plankton, you kind of like those little intermediate sections on a lake that have a river portion. If you got stabilized current there, there's not going to be any plankton there. It's like in a trout stream. Plankton's not going to live in current. That's why trout are eating bugs and other fish, carnivorous fish, is because there's no filter feeding, plankton eating bait fish in a trout stream. It's the same way on a lake when you're catfishing. If you go out and there's no plankton in the section of river that you're fishing, it could change the way you would want to actually target the fish. Sometimes if they've been running a lot of water, there's a lot of current, and there aren't any plankton, I'm going to fish it about like I would a river. If they've just shut the water off and it hasn't had time to stabilize yet with the amount of flow that it's having at the time, so the plankton hasn't had time to get back in there yet, I'll go hit the banks, target the flatheads that are up on the banks feeding on the bluegill. I'm not saying that you won't catch. I'm just saying this is something that I take into account whenever I go out there. Granted, not as much as I used to. When I was a striper fishing, I kind of looked more into that kind of thing. But now that I'm a catfisher, I'm going after fish that aren't doing what all the other fish are doing anyway. So I have no problem with getting skunked. Love you. Bye.